All right, I'm gonna try one more video, Nick. You said nobody ever knows what they're doing. That's the sum up of what you're basically trying to tell us. Nobody knows what they're doing. Um, okay, so knowing and doing are separate for you, or you're assuming that that must be the case, and you're saying that the knowing part always comes after the doing part. And even when the knowing part comes after the doing part, we don't know um, that we're knowing it. So because there's immediately another, thought that comes in about the knowing, about doing it, and so as soon as we think about an event in the world or an action that we ourselves have done, um, we start thinking about that and about that and about that and about that, and we're never thinking about what actually happened. We're thinking about the thought that came before the thought that came before the thought. Um, and it just goes off into infinite regress of incomprehensibility. And because of this, we need to insert frames into our passing experience to prevent the infinite regress from just carrying us off into insanity, really. The frames hold our mind steady and stable so that we can interact in a orderly and in a regular fashion with reality, with the world and other people. Um, but the thing is, we're assuming, you know, that the way scientific materialists understand causality is true. That anything that happens in the present is necessarily caused by something in the past. And the present doesn't have any ability to change the past, and so it's determined by it. So for scientific materialism, the future plays no role in the unfolding of the present. And common sense would seem to back that up, right? But if we understand and recognize at all, we must be experiencing something. So there's this thing called human experience that we all have. We all know it firsthand, um, and we're then saying that we know about the world that causality is strictly linear and strictly um, determined. In other words, there's only efficient causes, and maybe a material cause, but no formal or final cause, really, that has any influence on the efficient and the material cause. And those are, you know, terms that Aristotle developed. I'll put a link to the Wikipedia article that'll tell you what all those imply. But the efficient cause is basically just the mechanical cause. It's the gear that turned to turn the next gear. The formal cause would be, that directed and informed activity, and the final cause would be the direction in which it is headed, the goal of the organization, of the shape to which matter conforms. And of course, materialism is supposed to be based on also a material cause, which the problem though is that the quantum physicists now no longer really know what matter is. I mean, it's energy. Okay. What is energy? Well, it seems to be it's the inverse relation of gravity. What does that mean? Well, we don't really know what matter is anymore from a empirical perspective. It eludes, so far at least, our ability to know it objectively. To know it, we must build 17-mile long particle accelerators. In other words, to know what we must do, we must build, we must engineer nature such that it conforms to a particular concept which we have. And then from that we derive some conceptual knowledge that we can then use to build new, huge, fancy experiments. But that knowledge doesn't seem really to tell us anything but how to build a new experiment. Or at least that's the last, 100 years of physics. So we have to decide if we're going to take formal and final causes seriously. And I think to account for this thing, human experience, we kind of need to take those into account, because the very language we use to talk about so-called objective reality, where the past always causes the present, and everything reduces to atoms, when we talk about that, we can only talk about it in purposeful terms, in teleological terms, in terms which attribute agency to objects in the world when at the same time they deny agency to the world. They say the world is just dead stuff falling in a void, falling down aimlessly. But I think, as soon as we take our experience into consideration and forget that abstraction of scientific materialism for a second, as soon as we take experience into consideration, it's obvious that formal and final causes play a role. Biology itself is a science that cannot be done without attributing and recognizing the forms and the purposes of living matter. Living matter is manifestly purposeful and directed, self-organizing. Organisms have an identity, which, rocks and artifacts like pens and notebooks and remote controls, organisms have an identity. These are designed from the outside. Organisms actually feel from the inside out, rather than and that part of, they feel their own organization. They grow, and by growing, encounter an environment that pierces them, and it's the world is always directly emotional for us. We don't know it as a machine. Again, that's an abstraction. So if we return to our experience and we recognize that every time the outside world changes, that it affects us, A-F-F-E-C-T, as much as it effects us, E-F-F-E-C-T, then the world then is not only do we have free will, the world itself is will. The world has an intention independent of our own. Or in fact, the reason our experience is intentional is because the world provides us with that initial stimulus, that initial oomph that we feel inside that forces us forward. And with the forcing forward, we don't have to be pushed backwards. We can turn around and look. And the future for a human being is, of course, imaginable. You can anticipate it. You can not control what's going to happen, but intelligently prepare for what is going to happen. And there's too much evidence for that, not only in the empirical world with all these fancy things around us that we've built, but also in our own direct experience. I know what part of what I'm going to be doing tomorrow. I don't know exactly what's going to happen. I could be surprised, certainly, but usually I'm right about the general trend of tomorrow. And there's a lot to go into about what I just said, and I'm not going to have time to do that in this video, but hopefully something interesting was said.